So for some introduction, my name is Francisco Martin-Rayo. I'm a principal at the Boston Consulting Group. I specialize in public sector transformations, and so I hate to be the last thing between you guys and a break and lunch, but I promise to make the session very interactive. And really the idea is to just spend a little bit of time up front taking you through some of the larger considerations that government leaders are thinking through as they craft their artificial intelligence strategy, and then really make it very interactive, right? And really want to take out questions from the audience, hear what you're listening across the different countries that you guys are at and through your different industries. So very excited for this in general. So broadly, I just wanted to define very quickly, we all know what artificial intelligence means, but there isn't always an encompassing definition. And so what we're talking about here today is this idea of cognitive informatics, right? So as you look broader out into the circle, we're talking about natural language processing, robotics automations, computer-enabled perception and vision. And then as you get closer and closer to the core, right, the idea is to be able to give you as the human these tools to perceive better, interact more effectively, in some cases act on its own, and really optimize some of those decision makings. What's really interesting about where we are today in the history of artificial intelligence is that we're really looking at it as the third time that we're hoping or we see it taking off, right? And so what we've really seen historically since the early 1950s is this idea that people get really excited about artificial intelligence, and there's a tremendous amount of investment and attention to it. And then, as we saw in 1956, right? People discovered that it was available, that the stuff we'd read about in science fiction you could actually do. And then, 20 years or so later, you go, there's actually a lot of technological limitations. And so you see that level of investment, the level of enthusiasm start to die off. And then you get additional technological breakthroughs, right? Again, in the late 80s, expert systems, people get really excited. And then you go through the same issue where, the investors have put in, tens of billions of dollars into the technology, hadn't been able to see the returns. And so really, since the late 1990s, with certainly a faster acceleration over the last decade, we've started to see more and more and more wins in artificial intelligence. And so we're really looking almost at, is this the time where we're finally going to see it take off and become far more democratic and far more permeable through our different societies, right? And we just wanted to highlight a couple of the things that has allowed, I guess, today's artificial intelligence progress to almost crumb through into the public domain. Kasparov getting beaten, and then more recently, and if you guys haven't seen this documentary, AlphaGo defeating the Go world champion, which is, I encourage everybody to watch. It's very depressing, but it also allows humans to start rooting for other humans against the machine, which is something we might see more of in the next couple of decades. In this third age, I think there's three big things that we're focusing on. Here's how we're starting to leverage artificial intelligence. One is this idea of better statistical modeling, both with smaller and larger amounts. Obviously, probabilistic big data. I think that's where we see it most. And then the machine learning and deep learning. And what's really driving the ability to do these three things better is obviously just this sheer amount of data, which is dramatically increased, right? I mean, we've seen a 10x increase in the amount of data that's available. We're getting far more data from billions and billions of connected objects. There's been a ton of work done out there in terms of the type of personal information that we're now sharing with Google and Facebook and Amazon. And so for the first time, you have this perfect confluence of, you have the IT architecture necessary to be able to analyze this increasing amount of data at the same time that you have an extraordinary amount of data being collected both on individuals and more generally, which you haven't seen before historically. What's interesting about kind of that confluence is most people today, at least we've done for BCG, we do a lot of surveys. And one of the latest surveys that we've done on this, most people are already using AI technology, right? At some things it's relatively straightforward, like automatic translators, virtual assistants, or chat boxes. But what's interesting is, even though we've seen already, at least in business, the permeation of artificial intelligence technologies into the everyday, most people still don't really understand it. Regardless of whether you're the senior executive or an individual contributor, right, the employee, they don't really know what it is. and they don't really understand how best to leverage it, both to make their individual tasks easier, but also really how to engage it more strategically into the broader organization. Obviously, if this is what we're seeing in the private sector, it's significantly worse in the public sector. I mean, some recent analysis we did shows that on average, even some of the best governments are about 10 years behind the private sector. And we know, as you know, as we can see here in the data, the private sector isn't necessarily where it should be from an AI acceptance perspective. So if you really take a look at, now that we've kind of established the baseline of where the artificial intelligence revolution is today, you say, well, now that you're a government, what does it look like for you going forward? And we really think of it as two different poles. In terms of the core benefits, you realize, the whole purpose of the government is to produce positive outcomes for its citizens. And so artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, the analysis of data is an extraordinary opportunity to do that better, right? To improve those services, to make them more widely available. At the other end, some of the risks, the greatest risk that we see is less in the ability of doing it badly. It's both doing it badly and not doing it at all. And so again, right, if you're the public sector leader, you take a step back, you say, all right, if I'm engaged in this and I want to be able to deliver better services to my citizens, where are the 4 different pillars that I would start investing in? I think one is this idea of process efficiency, right? I mean, I think across all of our different countries, no one is ever excited about getting a new driver's license or renewing a whole set of, you move into a house, you need to get specific government permissions. No one is ever excited about that process. No one is ever excited about spending 7 to 9 hours a day waiting in line for a particular government piece of documentation. If you're somebody making minimum wage, sometimes you don't have that flexibility. And so in those areas, it's actually really exciting to be able to start embedding artificial intelligence to increase that efficiency. At the same time, what's really exciting is starting to see the new offering of public services. And it can be across a whole host of kind of different objectives and different projects that are available. And then finally, the 2 is this idea of expert decision making, which is really important in the sense that it can allow individual government workers, especially at the junior level, who are responsible often for making very consequential decisions at the individual level, they can make better decisions because they have access to better information and they have better access to decision-making protocols. And then more than anything, this idea of relationship excellence, right? And it really is going back to that core. Can we make sure that the government is providing better services to its citizens? There we go. This is just a double click into it. I'm not going to take you through all of it because I know it's a lot of text. But what's most interesting, I think, to me on this page is this idea of predictive analysis, right? So predictive analytics. And there we go. One of the things I wanted to point out is it's really interesting to start to see where you look at personalized services or communication, right? The use of artificial intelligence technologies like PredPol, CrimeScan, we've started to see some of that use by the FBI, LA, Chicago, New York police departments. What's interesting is because we have all this access to the data, because we have access to machine learning, artificial intelligence is able to start predicting where are the places where you need additional police support, where are the places where you need additional presence, if you will. At the same time, this is why it's so important to have that relationship with humans, because you want to make sure that you're not getting kind of racial or social bias into that analysis. And at the same time, it gives you almost that ethical or humane look at the type of data that's going forward. I think it's something that's really interesting. Governments today have greater access to this data than ever before. I think if you're thinking of rereading an interesting book over the next couple of months, I would encourage you to reread 1984 by George Orwell. What's interesting about reading that book is that the technology in that book is now widely available, right? I mean, I think Everybody carries a cell phone, which means everybody carries a camera, everybody carries a microphone with themselves at all times that governments can easily tap into. There's real value in the predictive analytics that can be done around that from a government perspective, but at the same time, there's a real risk of putting civil liberties at risk. At the task level, and we'll go into questions in just a quick second, the way you should think about AI, not just at the strategy level, where can you start investing in it, but at the individual level, either you can start substituting some of your public sector workers and start shifting some of those resources toward other higher value impact work, or you can start augmenting the type of work that they do. And if you really look at it, it's a continuum. And so at the one end, you've got potentially automatable jobs, right? And it's your back office stuff, your call centers, your chatbots. And then as you go all the way toward the limited impact, there you say, well, there's limited AI impact, and we can use it occasionally for better decision rights. We can use the technology to perform better surgeries. But most of the jobs that you're going to see in the public sector are in the middle. And so it's either making some of these jobs less strenuous and less repetitive, so you can use some of that excess capacity that you develop with your public sector employees to do other higher value added tasks, or kind of doing additional reinforcement of those jobs, right? Can we create more efficient processes? Can we do things faster? Can we make sure that the different touch points that citizens have with government are less painful? And so as you're looking through your organization, you want to be able to start identifying what are the types of tasks that you could fully substitute, and what are the types of tasks that you could start augmenting and freeing up some of that capacity. And that can help inform where you're placing your AI bets within the public sector and the organizations you run. Again, I think we've broadly talked about this, but this is just another analysis of the types of functions that we can see either augmented or replaced. And again, I think here the most interesting part on this slide is this idea of support functions, right? So for HR management, the judicial and financial control, again, it is those repetitive production operations, admin tasks, fraud detections. Very quickly on fraud detection, one of the biggest issues we have in the United States is trying to identify people who are trying to scam the government. It isn't possible for us to hire the right number of people to be able to stop fraud from occurring, especially around fraud that happens with the IRS, people who are applying for refunds for other people who are applying for refunds in an illegal fashion. What's been really interesting about kind of the advent of artificial intelligence and deep learning, it allows us to build an algorithm that identifies the most common characteristics of fraud and then only flag those applications. And so in your ideal state, if you have 100 million kind of tax returns being asked or tax refunds being asked for, you don't have the wherewithal to check all 100 million of them. But if you look at AI augmentation, right, and so you start to do it together, that algorithm can start to say, historically what we've seen are these 10 characteristics make it more likely that this refund is a fraud. And so instead of having to look at 100 million different tax returns, you're able to look at, maybe 50,000 that are the highest risk. And so again, that's where it's really important to have that conversation with kind of the individual citizens or the individual managers, where you say, if we can only look at 50,000, which are the right 50,000 returns to look at? Finally, coming back to this idea of, what do we see as the reason why the current AI revolution could stall again, right? How do we get to a third, what we're calling the AI winter? And what's really interesting about this data is most of the constraints that we're looking at here are actually not, they're not technological constraints. And so for the first time since the advent of AI in the mid-1950s, what you're really seeing is, we have the technological ability We have the infrastructure, we have the computing power, we have the availability of these tools to be able to do really interesting things. Most of the constraints we're seeing from an executive and public sector perspective are actually human. And so the third winter of AI that we're starting to see, if it happens, is likely to be driven by humane concerns, if you will, right? Budgetary, social, cultural, legal, ethical, regulatory, where we're going to see that environment start to give in a little bit more. And so that's really interesting, and it's something to keep in mind. And just last, I like this quote by Emmanuel Macron. It is really this idea that artificial intelligence is going to disrupt everything, right? It's going to disrupt all the different business models. It's also going to disrupt the public sector. It already is doing that. And then as a government leader or as a public sector leader, the way you need to think about it is both how can you use artificial intelligence, both to maximize your resources, to deliver better services to your individual customers or citizens as well. And also, what can you do to help unlock that labor productivity? I think on the negative side, right, this is something that's coming. This is already that's happening already. You want to make sure that your government's role isn't just reduced to a passive administrator, waiting for things to happen to it, because you will see major job displacement. You will see an over-reliance on the private sector if you want to bring in AI into the public sector. And you will start to see different issues of legitimacy. How much data is okay for individual companies to collect on citizens? What is the type of access that is okay? So that's the broad conversation that I wanted us to have today. What would be really interesting, and what I'd love to hear from you is really this idea of thinking further. So where do you think we're going? What are you most excited about? What are you most concerned about? So happy to take any questions. Happy to have that conversation.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chats for questions, and I think my point to start is from the previous slide you had. My worry is, and I'm like, since when I took the job to become a seed stage investor for a university fund in San Francisco, all the startups in 5 years ago were coming. It's like, I'm doing this in AI, I'm doing this in AI. So I had to learn at least the basics. I talked to a lot of more smarter people than I am. And what they all came to, all these conversations led to increasing in productivity in individual level, corporate level, government level. That will happen. But at the same time, there will be a huge job displacement. So people who will keep their jobs will be more productive, but people who do not adapt and whose jobs cannot be more productive, which is mostly manual labor focused, they will not have enough time or resources to shift. And this is this whole previous conversation, like everybody is using the same analogy, like there used to be people who would go to an ice on the winter, on a frozen lake on winter and cut ice. They were out of business. Or the horse carriages, they were able to shift towards becoming like car drivers. And then there was like this job placement category. But now we're not talking about a guy who was driving a carriage and now driving a car, or who was like cutting ice, but now like assembling some equipment. This is a complete different understanding. And given the fact that we have major injustices in the world in education, gender, it is going to be like a divisive route rather than an encompassing tool. I'm on the want to be optimist side, but currently I'm quite the pessimist one. So
yeah,
how do you?
It's a really interesting. It's a really interesting point, right? I think there's two things that are very different about this type of dislocation. One, the speed of the dislocation is a lot faster than it's ever been, right? So the Industrial Revolution took decades to
Absolutely
basically kick people out of jobs. You're able to pass technological changes much faster in today's environment,
yep.
And so you start to see that dislocation a lot faster. To your point on living in the unequal world, there was a really interesting analysis done by the IMF recently that actually showed that it's actually women in lower income jobs that are going to be disproportionately affected. So if you look at the tasks that you can automate versus the tasks that you will, augment with AI, it's mostly women in low-income countries that have the tasks that are more likely to be automated. And so I think as a public sector leader, the question is, how do you prepare for that? And I think there, what we, at least in the United States, we don't do very well at all, is create a social safety net that gives people the ability to retrain themselves with government funds and then decide where to go next. Right? I think part of the problem is, the idea is if we're trying not to use as much coal in the United States, right? We're trying to go toward kind of energy efficient producing, so on and so forth. And the idea is, well, we can get a bunch of coal miners and they can become UI UX developers, and they can become mobile coders. That's stupid, right? Because it's not an adjacency to the type of industry you're doing. But the best way to do it is to be able to give the tools to the individual. And by I mean the tools, I mean you give them the right access to education, you give them the right social safety net, so they can say, I'm going to spend the next 6 to 12 months building up a new skill set where I think I can do it. And I think that's what it's going to take. I really do think, goes on to your point, we have to develop a new social contract where we say we're going to have this, productivity improvement in so many ways. At the same time, we're going to have to support you through that revolution. And that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. And I think one of recent examples shows it's not as easy as it looks. I mean, it's never been easy anyways, but the social divide that we are seeing during the COVID pandemic lockdowns, the communities who are most impacted, the categories of people who are not able to work from home and will still need to go to work to make a living, that are by definition are more exposed, by definition are more susceptible to getting the virus, and by definition are more susceptible to getting damaged physically and economically out of this. It's so unbalanced, and in countries like US, it's been a mess. Countries like Brazil, it's been a mess. So it's kind of not a matter if the country is developed economically per GDP. It's like, what did that GDP have created in equivalent distribution of wealth? And that's really just putting the problem in our nose. It's very hard to compare what will happen next.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, right? I think what we could end up with, if you look at historically, right, there's certain moments in history where you have a global catastrophe, right? We had World War I, we had the Great Depression, we had World War II, and coming out of it, you start to see, I mean, the social safety net in Europe didn't occur, at least in Western Europe, until after the advent of World War II, right? Where I think communities looked and said, this is never going to happen again. We're happy to start paying higher taxes so that everybody has that minimum level.
Yep.
For the United States, it was the Great Depression that said, we called it the New Deal, right? And so that's when we put in a limited version of public health care, for example, a limited version of a social security payment for old people. I think exactly to your point, what's happening today, and given the divergence of outcomes, ideally we'll end up in a better place where government says, we can't allow this continued divergence of outcomes to be this wide. And so what is the new social contract that you're building with your citizens?
It's really interesting. I mean, I lived in the Bay Area for a while. And over the past 3 months, where you would assume people will be a little bit more optimistic because there's a presidential election coming, depending on which side, there's hope in one sense that things will make a little bit more sense. I have started getting emails from friends that I met through my network saying, oh, I'm planning to come to Turkey, which is like a really beautiful place to live in. If you're not in Istanbul and dealing with traffic, which for the last 6 months, I'm not at least dealing with it. It's like, can I live? Like, can I study? Can I work 3 months in Turkey? Can I travel to Greece easily from Turkey? Like, a lot of people are actually starting to consider turning that work from home attitude to a different lifestyle change. But again, that is completely dependent on the available skill sets these people have, like investors, startup founders, engineers, et cetera, et cetera. So there might be a really interesting path where this whole balance of people interactions and people flows might have an impact in countries. Like Estonia is becoming a really good hotspot for bringing people would work from home forever.
Yeah.
Same in Bali. Like there are some countries who are actually playing to that. And maybe now countries will start realizing, oh, if these people go, we're not going to have enough tax revenues. We can't even tax them if there's even a tax. So people are actually trying to shift. But the bottom billions will not be able to do that very easily. And there's social disorder and maybe a need for a new order as well. So where do you think BCG sees the larger tectonic shifts? Do you think that this is going to be a much longer lasting transformation of citizenship in terms of what governments look like to citizens? What do you see on that?
I mean, it's a good question. I think there's a lot of variables that we're still studying to better understand where we think it'll hit, right? I think a couple of them is kind of the efficacy and speed and distribution of a potential vaccine. What we've heard, me personally, right, this isn't BCG's view, what we've heard is, most COVID vaccines are only 60 to 70% effective. And if you do really well and you set up a distribution network where you are able to inoculate 70% of your population, if you've got 70% of them inoculated at a 70% effectiveness rate, that's only a 49% inoculation rate, right? And that's if you do it really well.
Absolutely.
So that means 1 out of every 2 citizens is not going to be inoculated against coronavirus. And so how good do we have to be for us to return to a sense of normalcy? So I think that's the biggest variable that people are looking at. The other 2 things to consider is it isn't just one vaccine, right? I know in the United States, we've got 6 vaccine trials going on. Obviously, there's at least 2 more in the UK. And so the question is, you as a government have to make the decision. All right, the first vaccine that came on is 70% effective. Do you make, if you're Germany, do you make 80 million doses of that? Or do you make 10 million doses of that, and then you wait until something that's 80 or 90% effective? The other part is there will be real dislocation in the way we work for our types of jobs, right? And it's deeply unfair, where I think the realization is we can work from anywhere in the world now, as long as you have an internet connection. And there's some time difference issues, right? It's easier for me to work in Europe. It's harder for me to work in the West Coast,
Singapore,
if most of my clients are in the East Coast. But it has created this huge divergence. And you say, how necessary is it really for all of us to be co-located? And if it's not necessary at all for these types of jobs, what does it mean for the future of cities? I think financially, what we're very worried about is kind of a coming crisis in commercial real estate, right? All of the buildings that people
absolutely.
Why would you continue to pay premium prices for that? I think it'll also be hard to get people to go back to the way things were. Ozan, to your point, why would you spend 60 to 90 minutes in traffic getting to the office when you could save 2 to 3 hours a day and work from home?
Yeah.
I think those are the biggest locations.
Yeah, in the very beginning of the day, we had the managing director of WeWork in Middle East. And I think what I thought at the beginning of the COVID era was like WeWork and other co-working flexible offices will just shut down. But now, to your point, when commercial real estate is in deeper trouble than flexible working spaces, because corporations will downsize in terms of numbers of people coming to the office, but if they cannot work from home, which is not really efficient, effective, or sustainable in a way, then these individuals will need to spend some part of their work hours, which is now extended actually, outside of their home. But where are they going to go? So I think what will happen is there's going to be very little micro spaces where 3, 4, 5 people get in, or like large infrastructures like WeWork that will create that flexible space. So if you're not going to work from home, then you're going to spend 6 hours in a location that's is kind of protected and everything else. But it's really interesting. So we have one question from actually and a student that I invited, which is, will we be able to, but that's like a little technical. How will international there was another question, so I'll jump onto CK. How will international governments interact with bodies like United Nations in kind of making sure this equality works?
I don't necessarily think that's I personally am a big believer in multilateralism, and I think the international system has brought us an unrivaled amount of peace and prosperity over the last 70 years. That said, my gut is that the UN is not the right forum for this, and unfortunately, I think most decisions will be made at the country level. Right. I think what's most worrisome from an AI perspective is what we see in China, for example, in the Xinjiang province. I mean, yes, there's 1 million Uyghurs that are in concentration camps, but also, I mean, the entirety of the province. I mean, you've seen some of these analyses come out of the New York Times. It is the most extraordinary and both terrifying use of artificial intelligence technology that we've ever seen, just in terms of the sheer amount of cameras, analysis, surveillance, data mining, predictive analytics against humans. I don't think that we will be able to come to a common ethical lens worldwide in terms of what the right usage is of AI. So I do unfortunately think it will be kind of at the country level. One other interesting point is what we're starting to see will be probably a divergence of systems, where I think Europe is doing an excellent job in sort of GDPR, right? So trying to put in those individual protections, privacy protections. I think that can be extended to artificial intelligence, obviously. But you will see this divergence of systems where certain countries will be much more concerned with individual privacy, individual rights, and will look to tame the use of AI and surveillance technology from their governments. And other certain countries will be simply much more excited to be able to leverage that technology to bolster an autocratic regime. I think the scary part is it is getting cheaper to do it.
Absolutely.
So
hopefully, as we say in the region, inshallah, things will go well. But I think this is far too important to leave it to God to handle. We humans have to deal with all these problems. But thank you so much, Francisco. It was really great to take your views and like take a broader picture on how governments have been working and corporations as well. So